Hello everybody, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel I talk about digital media, game design and spatial audio. Now in this video I would like to address a couple of questions that came up and try to give them my best answers. I might actually do some more extensive videos about some of those questions in the future, but that might still be a while, so I decided to at least give them a brief answer now so that they have some ideas of what my thoughts are, and maybe we get in a discussion and you can ask me some follow-up questions that I can address later. Now with that being said, let's get right to it. The first question comes from Secret Squirrel. Question: I'm not asking to be argumentative, but to learn from home why use waves and X as opposed to the embodies immerse. I'm genuinely not arguing for one or the other. I have not purchased either, but I own Nuendo and Steinberg sells both. So I didn't know if headphone monitoring in immerse would be better for with NX or immerse. And I decided to use this question as a representative for many other questions that I'm getting. Why do you use NX? Couldn't we use this system? What actually is the difference between monitoring in that way and the other way? What's actually the difference between the different formats? What's the difference between Ambisonics and Dolby Atmos? What's the difference between stereo and binaural? So I figured it might make sense to actually talk a little bit about the different types of formats that we have and why we would like to monitor them in a certain way. Now this is going to be, it is going to be important that I try to be as accurate in this description as possible. So while I normally don't like jump cuts, that's actually a creative choice. I figured that in this particular segment, I might actually throw in at least one or maybe two or maybe three jump cuts, because I think it's really important that I get this absolutely accurate and that everybody knows exactly what I'm talking about. So first things first. When we're talking about how to capture sound or how to represent sound, we can look at it from three different perspectives. We can think of sound as something that has a physical property, a sound field that is around me. And that sound field represents the sound pressure in certain directions. But it is a physical property. It does not depend on a speaker system. It doesn't really depend on my ears. It only depends on my location in three-dimensional space. It doesn't even depend on the direction in which I'm looking. It just depends on my position, on what's called the sweet spot. And everything else is a physical property of the pressure distribution of the sound waves that are reaching that particular position. So that's the first way to look at it. The second way to look at sound or the representation of sound is by looking at it from the perspective of an emitter. So we have systems that emit sound. Those are speaker systems, stereo speaker systems, surround sound speaker systems, Dolby Atmos speaker systems, maybe even headphones, but they're all speaker systems. So we can look at sound as something that is reproduced through an emission system, through an emitter, through a speaker system. So that's the second way to look at sound. The third way to look at sound is from the perspective of the receiver. Now the receiver usually, but not always, can be the human ears. So how do I actually receive the sound in my ears? How do the ears function as something like a microphone? And how can I represent that sound that is entering my ears and reaching my brain? So once again, we can look at sound from three different perspectives. As something that is a sound field around me, as something that is emitted from a speaker system, and as something that is received through my ears. And depending on how we look at sound, we have different formats, different audio formats that represent sound from that particular perspective. When we look at sound from the first perspective, where sound is seen as something that has physical properties, a sound field around the sweet spot, then there's one exact mathematical representation, and that mathematical representation is a function over a sphere. Now, if we want to describe that from a computational perspective, the easiest way to do that is to turn that into an Ambisonics format. And more accurately, actually, into Ambisonics B format. I'm going to talk about the A format very, very briefly a little bit later. Now, I do know that there are many variations of Ambisonics out there. Some are not even called Ambisonics. We talked about the Facebook format, which technically is a mixed order Ambisonics format, but in essence, they are all the same. Now, if we look at sound from the second perspective, where we think of it as something that is emitted from an emission source, like a speaker system, there's where all our traditional audio formats come in. Stereo, surround sound, 5.0, 5.1, 7.1, 7.1.2, even Dolby Atmos is of that form. In Dolby Atmos, the only thing that you have is that you have additional virtual emission sources, which are the objects, but in reality, it is descriptive from the perspective of the emission source and not of the sound field like we had in the Ambisonics. Now, when we look at sound from the third perspective, the perspective of the receiver, we arrive at binaural audio. This is audio that is rendered in exactly the way the human ear would hear it. So we're taking the shape of the ear into account, we're taking the shape of the head into account, and we're trying to optimize the sound in such a way that I'm getting the exactly correct representation of that particular sound as if I would hear it in real life. Now, this is primarily meant for audio that we listen on headphones, but over the last couple of years, it has become sort of a way also as an effect that can be used in music or any audio production to get a little bit of an immersive feeling, simply because most people will listen to audio on headphones these days. But it is important to remember that when we talk about stereo, we talk about audio with the perspective of the speaker system, whereas when we're talking about binaural audio, we're talking about audio from the perspective of my ears. Now, technically, Ambisonics A format also falls into that category, but that's something that I'm going to talk about in some of the future videos. We don't need to be confused right now. So why do we need monitoring with respect to my head position? And the reason for that is very, very simple. If I have a binaural render, it only renders the audio with respect to one fixed head position. It renders it accurately. It tries to use psychoacoustic effects to make sure that I hear the audio in exactly the same way I would hear it in real life. But my head position is fixed. What I would like to have is I would like to also be able to really understand the spatial relationship between the different objects in Dolby Atmos, or the spatial relationships between the sound pressures that I'm getting in an Ambisonics system. And for that, I need to be able to render the audio with respect to the position of my head. And that's why I use Waves NX. Now, there are not a lot of head tracking solutions out there. I dearly hope that we're getting a little bit more in the future. I'm actually waiting for one solution that looks promising. But other than that, at the moment at least, the only consumer-friendly solution that I think is available right now is the Waves NX solution with all the shortcomings that it has. It's certainly not perfect. And you certainly need to have a mix of different monitoring systems. So it can certainly not be the only way to monitor immersive audio. But it is the best way to monitor immersive audio with respect to monitoring the three-dimensional positioning of objects in a three-dimensional space. The second question comes from WaveSpot. Kindly make a video monitoring 7.1.4 bus holding Atmos renderer directly with DVR monitor. I hope it's very less complicated and straightforward setup. Now, I'm certainly able to do that, so let's get right to it. This is the project that we used. It's an render project. I'm not going to go through the details. I invite you to go through the previous videos where we talked about that. But essentially what we have is we have two tracks. We have a drum track, we have a bass track. The bass track is our object. The drum track serves as our Dolby Atmos bed. That means that I've routed the drum track into a separate bus, which is a 7.1.2 bus. That is the Dolby Atmos bed. Dolby Atmos bed goes into the Dolby Atmos renderer as a bed. And the bass goes directly into the renderer as an object. So if I'm opening up the renderer, I essentially have a 7.1.2 bed here, and I have a stereo object, or more accurately, actually two separate mono objects. And if I open up the ADM authoring window here, I see essentially the two things that I have. Now, once again, this is very, very simple. Both are actually stereo. And if I'm playing that now, I only going to see stereo information. Here, I have no panning yet. So this is essentially everything that I had so far. So the question now was, can I add or can I use a different monitoring system? One of the problems that we ran into is that if I'm using the downmix function in the Dolby Atmos renderer, especially the binaural downmix function, what it's going to do is it's going to throw out the LFE channel. I was not aware of that when I first looked at that, but it apparently does it, at least on Noendo. I cannot re-enable the LFE channel. I should actually be able to do that in the Dolby Atmos renderer. So if somebody out there kind of looks at the at the external renderer, if it allows you to actually get that LFE channel back into the system, I would be interested to know if that works. In Nuendo, I can't. In Nuendo, it is simply disabled. So the question then is, might there be a better way to monitor that? And one way obviously would be to simply go 7.1.4 and then use the Nuendo downmix to get that impression, that stereo impression. But obviously, many of you are very interested in using alternative renderers or alternative downmix solutions, and you can certainly do that. And it's actually fairly straightforward to do that. Now, this is a 7.1.4 track. The easiest way to go about that is to simply add a downmix plugin after the Dolby Atmos renderer. Because the renderer just functions as a plugin Nuendo. The audio is just channeled through that bus, and I can process it after the Dolby Atmos renderer, something which, by the way, I can't do in DaVinci Resolve Fairlight. So what I can do is I can simply, after the renderer, add an additional downmix plugin, and the one that has been requested the most is the DVR monitor. So monitor. So it's the DVR monitor. The DVR monitor system, and I guess many of you have that plugin available because it comes with the Plugin Alliance subscription. So if you are subscribed to one of the bundles in the Plugin Alliance system, then you essentially have that included. And what you can do here is you can select the type of monitors or speaker system that you want to monitor. And this sits on a 7.1.4 track. So really all you need to do is you need to tell the plugin that the input is a 7.1.4 track, and then you will get the speaker setup, and I can now monitor that through that system. Now, because of the way Nuendo downmixes 7.1.4 tracks into stereo tracks, this is actually all I would need to do. However, just to be on the safe side, I would recommend disabling the downmix plugin in Nuendo. Once again, it's not really going to do anything because it's just going to take the left and right channel and move them on, and the DVR monitor plugin is just going to produce a left and right output, so it's actually not going to have any impact. But just to be on the safe side, we don't really want Nuendo to do anything at that point. We want DVR to do the downmix. So let me just disable that here, and let's have a listen. Now this is very quiet, so I need to up the gain a bit in order to get to the same. Now obviously the advantage here is I can rotate the head. So this is sort of my head rotation. This would be equal to me moving my head in this direction. And I have different mix rooms that I can try out. So I can look or I can listen or monitor that. How would that sound in, I don't know, in a car or in a kitchen or in a stadium. And it does do the panning correctly. So if I'm taking the bass track, for example, and I'm moving that to the hard left or the hard right, well, actually in the stadium it doesn't really kind of give me a good impression. So let's go back to the mix room. So I essentially can pan hard left, hard right, or the drum, and obviously also in up and down direction. Now, as I said before, if you go through the DVR system, it does not allow you to monitor vertical information, which is the big disadvantage. But other than that, this is actually a really nice one, and you can certainly do it that way. And the setup is very simple. You can also put that on if you use the control room setup, you can also put that on the control room bus and have it as an insert in the control room. But this works just fine that way, and that's actually very easy. And if you export Dolby Atmos content, you would export that through the Dolby Atmos renderer anyway. So the system, the export would never really reach that plugin. It would be exported from the renderer directly. So this is a good way to do. Now there are a couple of different options out there that you can use. You don't need to use the DVR system. There are a couple of other options out there as well. And as I said before, a French company reached out to me. They have actually a very interesting binaural downmix solution that I'm going to look into in the near future, even with a head tracking system attached to it. So that's exciting. But you know, DAWR is a good solution. So if you want to use them, yes, absolutely, and it's very simple to do. Third question comes from Gatot Alindo. I hope I pronounce your name correctly. Wondering why you're not using Waves NX on this. Thank you for the video. And this was a question in response to the DaVinci Resolve Fairlight video, where I looked into how to use Dolby Atmos on DaVinci Resolve Fairlight. And I hadn't looked at that at that time, but I have since then had a look at that. And unfortunately, it seems that actually is not really possible, at least not on Windows. And I can tell you why that is. Let me go into an empty, this is really an empty DaVinci Resolve session. And you know, what you would normally do is you would go into the project settings, and then you would enable the immersive audio options. So let's enable all of them. And as soon as we enable all of them, we have all the different options that Fairlight gives us. And unfortunately, Ambisonics is not one of them. So if we go into the video and audio input-output session, if I want to create a manual output, I have a number of different formats, Dolby Atmos, Aura, MPEG, and so forth, but I don't really have an Ambisonics output. The reason why I would need an Ambisonics output is because Waves NX is an Ambisonics plugin. So unless I have something that specifically designed to take in Dolby Atmos content and does the head tracking with Dolby Atmos content directly, I need to first convert it into Ambisonics format and then can monitor through Waves NX. Now, obviously, one way to go around that would be to simply have you know, kind of a 7.1.4 output and then route that into a separate application that just hosts the plugin that downmixes from 7.1.4 to Ambisonics and then uses Waves NX to monitor Ambisonics. But that will require me to channel 12-channel audio from one application in Windows to another application in Windows. And there is one solution where we could do that is Dante. However, it does not work with, or at least I did not get it to work with DaVinci Resolve, because that would require an ASIO driver, and DaVinci Resolve doesn't work with ASIO. So on Windows, I have not yet found a solution to monitor that in fully immersive way. You could obviously, you could work around by downmixing it to a 7.1, and there are solutions in Windows where you can channel 8-channel audio from one application to the other. You can do that with the virtual audio cables. But that's about it, and that essentially means that you could technically monitor things that are in horizontal relationship to each other. So you can monitor them in spatial positioning horizontally, but you cannot monitor the vertical axis, which might be enough depending on what you want to achieve. And I might actually do a separate video on how to do that in the future, but in Windows at least you can't do that vertical. Now on a Mac, on the other hand, loopback and other solutions exist that would allow you to channel 12-channel audio from one application to another. So I currently don't really have a Mac system around, so I might actually do that in the future to see how that works. But it should technically be possible to use DaVinci Resolve, then something like Loopback, and something like Live Professor to channel the 7.1.4 audio into Live Professor, and then in Live Professor downmix it and with head tracking enabled. So that's something I might also do and show in the future. But at the moment, unfortunately, if you're on Windows and you want to monitor Dolby Atmos content with active head tracking, you're a little bit out of luck, at least according to my knowledge. If anybody out there has some additional ideas or thoughts or managed to do that, I would really be interested to know more. As I said in the video about DaVinci Resolve Fairlight, I'm not an expert in DaVinci Resolve. So if you are an expert and you know how to do that, please let me know. I'm highly interested in learning more. So the final question of the day comes from RoboJazz. And RoboJazz wants to know, is there a particular set of headphones you'd recommend for accurate mixing monitoring of Atmos and Nuendo? I've been experimenting using Immerse, and some seem to have a wider, deeper sound field than others. Thank you for all the great information. Well, first of all, thank you. And kind of when it comes to headphones, there are a lot of different options out there. And what I would say is, don't think too much about the frequency response. That's usually something that people are obsessed about. We want to get the flattest response possible, but I'm going to talk about in a second why this might actually not be necessary or not even be a good idea, especially when you're talking about headphones. What you really want is you want to have an accurate sound stage. I think that's the way audiophiles call it. Very detailed. So any good headphones should actually be sufficient. So any audiophile headphone should actually work. Now, when it comes to frequency response, and I'm actually planning on doing a follow-up video on that, because that's something that became a little bit personal over the last couple of months. I found out that my hearing is less than perfect. I didn't know that apparently always was like that for most of my life. There are certain frequencies that I hear better than others, and I do also have some age-related stuff at the higher frequencies. Kind of when you get old, there are certain frequencies you no longer hear, but they're sort of, my ears don't really have a flat frequency response. So for the most of the time, I was hunting for the perfect headphones, the perfect pair of headphones that would give me the perfect flat frequency response, only to find out that my ears don't really perceive it as flat. So the whole thing is more or less pointless. And that also explained a little bit why my headphone of choice, which is the Biodynamic DT 1990 Pro, sometimes gives me a little bit of a grief, and that has to do with the fact that this one is really, really good, but it is a little bit shouty. It's sort of, the higher frequencies are very, I wouldn't say dominant. It's a very bright headphone, let's put it that way. Very, very detailed, but very, very bright. And as it turns out, the frequencies that this headphone is particularly bright in, or that really kind of dominate here, are also the frequencies that my ears hear better than others. So I get this double effect, and that has the effect that sometimes this is a little bit fatiguing, and it starts to hurt at a certain point. So I'm sensitive to these higher frequencies, and that's sort of something that I became aware. Now, if I really want to go into lower frequencies, what I started to really like is the blue MoFi. And I saw essentially on some of the YouTube channels, some of the producers actually using them for monitoring low frequency information, and they're really, really good. Now, once again, these are colored, but and I cannot say this often enough, our ears are colored. So kind of when it comes to headphones, everything is a little bit relative anyway. I will make a follow-up video on that, because that's something that became a little bit personal, primarily because I see so many people getting very upset and frustrated because they lose the hearing once they reach a certain age. And that doesn't have to be that way, quite frankly. There are many reasons why we can still continue to work even if our hearing is less than perfect. And unless you're a professional that really needs to know exactly, or unless you're somebody who is just starting out to become a professional, you don't have the experience on how to deal with certain frequencies that you no longer hear the same way you used to hear. So unless you're really kind of starting to become a professional audio engineer while you already have a hearing problem, I think we can work around most of this problem. So if you're interested in sort of the way I approached my less than perfect hearing, let me know. I'm definitely going to do a video in some future weeks, because I think it is an important thing to say, and I have not seen anybody address that problem yet. Well, this is everything I wanted to say today, and thank you so much for all your questions and comments. They have been really helpful. In education, we say that the teacher is usually the one person that learns the most, and that is certainly true here. I'm learning more than ever in this, in creating these videos, and I really appreciate that. So keep your questions coming, and I'm more than interested in answering all of them. And with that being said, do all the things people do on YouTube, like, subscribe, and otherwise see you at the next video.